Welcome back. Hope you had a nice lunch. All right, this is our first of our day two afternoon sessions. And I think like our late morning session on the soft launch of the Prevent project, I think this panel also needs a little bit of a setup for you to sort of fully understand what's going on. So why not, I'll do that. I'm going to take just a few minutes to do that, and then I'm going to just dive right into our topic. So we have, IGMAP has been truly blessed since its very beginning to have a deep and really productive partnership with our NGO partner, the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, which is a global organization with headquarters with offices in New York, Buenos Aires, Bucharest, Kampala, and kind of sort of Auschwitz, but kind of sort of Thailand, Bangkok now. Yes, kind of. Okay, it's an extraordinary organization that does extraordinary things, and we partner with them on a lot of things. What we're talking about today with you is a 3-year collaborative policy research and advocacy project that AIPG and IGMAP cooked up in the context of a real ongoing question of trying to understand what was making effective state civil society coordination and collaboration so difficult on issues of broadly speaking, of atrocity prevention. So there's an old saying, you know, everybody thinks that coordination is a great idea, but nobody wants to be coordinated. And which is really true. And what we were finding was that there were so many misaligned incentives or misunderstood incentives about effective, timely, and sustainable coordination between sectors, between civil society and states. On issues of consequence, that we really wanted to launch a 3-year project to try to explore how those kinds of incentives could be realigned, focusing on one specific area. And the area that we picked was something that I don't think any of us saw coming, but we eventually realized this is really quite a relevant topic. It has to do with the conjunction, with the nexus between atrocities and displacement. Atrocities displace. People move away from atrocities. They move away internally. They move away across international borders and become refugees. Without launching into a whole thing about human displacement, what I think we kind of know is that across the arc of displacement, from the sending country to one or maybe multiple transit countries to a host country or multiple host countries, displacing as a result of as a response to the threat or the reality of atrocities, maybe reduces some kinds of vulnerability but introduces others. And we were interested in that phenomenon because receiving countries, hosting countries, are often, in fact, usually relatively ill-prepared to address the particular kinds of vulnerabilities. And I think SGBV is one of the human trafficking, discrimination, hate speech, marginalization, persecution, are, even in well-intentioned states, realities that displaced populations experience regularly. And so we formed a plan to take a 3-year arc of project and study 3 different countries. The countries were radically different in every way, but they had a number of different things, a number of important things in common. One, they were relatively healthy democracies. 2, they had big, noisy, effective, and boisterous and influential civil societies. And 3, for various reasons, all 3 of these countries have really turned against the prevailing global tide of understanding displacement as a security threat, understanding forced displacement as a problem of nationalism, understanding it as a existential problem to be solved, and saw it as an obligation, but also as an opportunity to welcome, assist, and in many cases integrate new refugees. In other words, there were a lot of good intentions. And what we were interested in was when, the third thing is actually more important. None of them were traditional host countries, and therefore they didn't have necessarily the political, governmental, legal, or civil society infrastructure that would have developed had there been a longer tradition or a longer experience of receiving displaced populations. So we were interested in how these countries did in fact respond to sudden refugee flows from of people displaced by mass atrocities, how they managed, or to what extent they managed, coordination across different government and non-governmental actors, and what were the effects of the policies that they introduced in actually addressing and reducing the risk of identity-based violence for displaced persons within their hosting country. This is the third of the 3 years. The first year we looked at the Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. Last year we looked at refugees, especially long-term displaced refugees, in the 2 mega camps in Kenya. And this year, with the third and final round, is Ukrainian refugees having been displaced into Romania. So that's the setup. We have each one of these rounds has a 3-day workshop, and we follow up each one of those workshops several months later with one of these. And so we're delighted that our AIPG partners are here, and one of our repeat offenders who has been not just to the Romania workshop, but I think to every workshop over the past 3 years is here, along with another guest. And so we're just going to talk about this a little bit. Romania did not necessarily receive as large an influx of Ukrainian refugees in the weeks immediately following the Russian invasion as other countries, for example, perhaps as Poland did, but they received plenty. Romania's response, I think it's safe to say, especially in the first, let's say, 12 months following this very large influx of overwhelmingly women and small children, was in many ways extraordinarily moving. I know that there was an exceptional, generous response, both from civil society and from government and from individuals.
You're stealing our thunder.
Maybe I should stop talking now. Which brings me to my last point. We have here 4 people whose opinions you're finally going to hear. So to my left is Anatoly Kostyuk, who is Vice President for the Romanian Center for Comparative Migration Studies. Tony, he's Tony to you, but welcome, Tony. It's great to have you here. Next is Tanya Domi, who's an Adjunct Assistant Professor of International Public Affairs at Columbia University. Next is the wonderful Gabby Gindia, who's Director of Mediterranean Basin Programs for AIPG. And finally, it's Dr. Tibi Gallants, who is the Executive Director of AIPG. And so we have Team Romania is here in the house, as well as the rest of us. So Tony, I'm going to start with you just to lead things off. And you know how this works. I mean, everybody else just jumps right in. Describe, if you will, sort of what were the contributing factors that made the initial mobilization of response to this unexpected and dramatic influx of displaced persons. Describe the structural and the other kinds of factors that contributed to that initial, really quite positive and in many ways quite effective response.
Yeah, amazing question, and
I think now it's the right time to ask it for several reasons. There are a number of projects, research conducted now. So we finally understand what has happened. One of them, which I'm currently involved in, it's a discussion with our leaders, political figures, public employees, and we want to understand what was the leadership response, the middle management, top management response. And many of them described a situation where there was not much happening in the first hours. Then they started to be called by political figures in Europe, from Germany, from the European Parliament, saying, guys, you have to do something and you have to be involved. And that was something that we discovered in so many of the interviews we've done with these political figures. And I think this is one of the most important. I mean, there are a number of explanations, a number of things we've seen discussed and presented in various ways. The common threat, right? The Russian, the terror of Russia. The composition of the socio-demographic composition of the people fleeing to Romania, kids and women, right? The common culture, the shared border, things like that. But I think one additional topic which gets little credit, which played a significant role, is this top-down approach where many of the politicians in Romania, many of the managers in various organizations, companies, got phone calls literally from their counterparts all over the world, United States included, and they were somehow pushed and advised to do something, to do a bit more, to be a bit more involved, because there were a few days in the beginning when not that much happened, and there were only civil society and only individuals going at the border and trying to do something. I was there in the first days, and everybody has tea, home, right, or bread or clothes, and you can take them with you at the border. But not everybody has toilets, right? This was one of the first things you could see, but there was almost no toilet at the border. Not everybody can bring their tents or things that are absolutely essential. And yeah, that's part of it.
Can I please chime in? I remember that during the first days, probably, or 1 day and a half, there was a significant hesitance from state authorities. What we do, it was an exceptional situation. Although we knew that this will develop and escalate, the situation will escalate, none of us could conceive that a large-scale invasion was actually taking place in 2022.
So you knew there was going to be a heart attack, but you didn't know what day.
What day?
Could you use a microphone? We cannot hear.
I'm sorry. Now, is it better? Thank you so much. So I would say that several civil society organizations were monitoring, and the press was monitoring the situation and keep on building up pressure also on the state responses. We need to do something, we need to do something. People were starting to organize on social media. As you say, political counterparts were getting phone calls from Europe. And I think the pressure that colleagues from the civil society also built up and also encouraged a bit, the fast response of the state, and was also decisive in that first moment. And luckily, and I would like to say that it was, and you almost took it away from me, it was one of the historic moments when I really felt relieved and proud that the entire society, Romanian society, stepped up and showed real, not just compassion and empathy, but real leadership in managing an unprecedented crisis situation. Thank you.
Maybe I just jump in to give us some of the details, because I don't think everybody's familiar with the situation. The way the response happened, given that there is not a big tradition of Romania being a receiving country for refugees. At that point, or migrants, there was not a lot of infrastructure. There were quite a bit, there was a paper trail because you have to have plans. Nonetheless, they were not implementable, most of the plans, because they were devised thinking about crises the way they looked in the 90s. So consequently, there was not lots of protocol for public institutions to deploy the resources that were needed to receive such a huge influx of refugees. So what the governmental institutions decided to do, and that was rather unprecedented in the history of the Romanian state engaging with a crisis, was to develop an actual partnership with civil society, both understood as NGOs and as corporate actors, to deliver immediately, as soon as possible, resources needed by the refugees. And this actually manifested in one of the secretaries of state who was working at that time, they created a WhatsApp group that was very much identifying the needs that were faced by the refugee community coming in, and who could deploy those, who could meet those needs in the best way possible, as soon as possible, while also being, conflict sensitive, being aware that there were huge risks at the moment of crossing the border and coming into Romania. And that was also a thing that was very interesting to see, that there was conflict and risk sensitivity on the side of both civil society and the government in that moment, because as a Romanian, maybe I can say this, that's not traditionally a characteristic of planning in crisis time.
There was a plan. There were resources allocated, right? This emergency agency dealing with a crisis like this, they were prepared. They had the plans. They had all the infrastructure necessary. I don't know where there was this gap. I think many people felt in the beginning that Russians are going to take it. People are not going to cross the border in such large numbers. And I think that's one of the things in one of these regions.
Yeah, let me help.
I just want to add another detail about the level of coordination. So after this WhatsApp group was created, soon software engineers and software experts jumped in and created a platform. There was an NGO, Code for Romania, which created a platform called Dopomofa, if I remember correctly, in coagulating vetted information and putting it, making it available for different actors in different languages, trying to match needs with offers. And so again, the process was structuring really fast in real time, and this is also something unprecedented for our country.
And if I just one idea here, it's, together with Eric Martin, we did this research only in one place in Romania, also a hub, one of the places where millions of people passed through Ukraine. And what was really interesting is that this WhatsApp group was replicated at the local level, so that there wasn't only government, and that slowly institutionalized it in a way or another, also by developing a bit more complex platforms, also inviting people, stakeholders, private companies. But you're right, initially that was the very strange way of communication.
And it set a precedent for this partnership at all levels, which was, again, very unusual in the Romanian state that has certain post-authoritarian legacies that
You were an unlikely candidate for disproving the old adage that everybody thinks coordination is a good idea, but nobody wants to coordinate. I mean, you wouldn't have thought, I say this with love, you wouldn't have thought that the Romanian government would be at the cutting edge of a successful, real-time, super rapid, efficient, accountable coordination in response to a massive human crisis like this. I want to drill down, and before we move on, I want to drill down a little bit to one particular dimension of what we're talking about now, this initial coordination across civil society and state and the national government, as well as the county and municipal governments in the first days. And this is part of the popular response. It's like Romanians, especially those in counties where on the border where there were established border crossings, got the news and said, I'm going to make a basket of sandwiches. I'm going to bring diapers. I'm going to make get a flask of tea. Many, many, many people, uncoordinated and sort of independently, physically go there to where there's a stream of exhausted, frightened, and disoriented women often with their kids moving in. Now, when you have that situation, it can be a perfect recipe for human trafficking. And in fact, we know from other contexts that this is a sort of a structural feature of that kind of displacement experience, is that not everybody's there to hand out sandwiches, right? My understanding, though, is that the ability, the initiative to try to vet aid groups and the staff of aid groups who had shown up at the border to make sure that they would clear a vetting process to attempt to preempt and reduce the structural risk of human trafficking worked. Can you tell me something a little bit more about that? Because, I mean, wow.
There were some prominent cases that also made it to the headlines, who tried indeed to be involved in this type of illegal activities. I think, and we can circle back here to yesterday and to discussion why you need well-prepared and well-trained law enforcement agencies. I think in this case, the Romanian and different structures from the Romanian law enforcement sector rised up to the expectations and try to do their best, because I'm sure you know there are several networks and these names were well known within these databases.
I'd like to now shift the conversation a little bit and ask you to help us think through the role of another important actor here, which would be the European Union, and how the EU in general and the TPS in particular changed dramatically many, many different aspects of this experience.
So the TPS is the Temporary Protection Scheme. And that's increasingly criticized if that was a smart and good idea. I think it gave the flexibility that we all needed in the beginning. But now, on long term, we see there are problems. Being in this limbo, waiting for unlimited time, you don't know it's the past, the permit is renewed every year. Right? You cannot project a long-term inclusion into the society if you don't know for sure how it's gonna work for how long, and with what kind of result. And now we are seeing that this is also part of the problem and part of the intolerance and discrimination against Ukrainians in Romania and in other countries. Also, something that worked very well in the beginning, it was very helpful. Now it's exactly the other. In addition to the leaders calling and pushing for activation of all kinds of plans and strategies, I think most of the money came through European funds in the beginning. We and other countries, I think, did exactly the same. The focus was to support the families who received Ukrainian refugees, so the money did not reach the Ukrainians themselves, but the households, the Romanian households. And that was a very strange and left a lot of room for interpretation in various ways. There were huge corruption scandals around them. Thousands of people crossed the border just to be registered and then move back to Ukraine, and that happened in several ways. And that also led to a total change. So now the situation is the other extreme. Ukrainians get almost nothing from the state after initially it was quite generous for Romanian standards. And also very interesting, it created the context for fake news and misinformation based on these initial figures and on this initial generosity. During the last rounds of elections, there were lots of stories saying that Ukrainians get a lot of benefits, and this is where our money is going. It's going for our communities are left without these resources because they are channeled to the Ukrainian.
Talk to us a little bit. I mean, refugees, displaced people always hope that they're going to be able to go home and go home soon. Go home to their families. Many of these women had left their husbands behind. They didn't have long-term plans for integration into Romania. But we know for sure that the idea of returning home safely and quickly is not the typical refugee story. We learned, for example, in the Kenyan experience of for example, refugees from Somalia who, in some of the massive mega camps in rural Kenya, who now have a second and a third and soon a fourth generation of refugees born in the camp. So it's not entirely clear whether if they're ever going to leave. What have been they've been in the Ukrainian population of displaced people has been in Romania for several years now. What have been, in your views, and this is where I'm hoping to draw on some of Tanya's comparative experience in parallel situations in the Balkans. What have been, in your views, some of the most significant obstacles or impediments to successful integration, whatever that means, whatever you mean by success? I'll start with Tibi, and maybe we'll go back this way.
I should probably give the word on this to my colleagues. They are much more familiar with it than Tanya, but I have a thought about the TPS that I will come back to, if you don't mind.
So you mean, what were the initial challenges to successful integration?
What have been over the course of the 4 years? What have been the most stubborn, maybe the most unexpected, or the most challenging obstacles to integration?
Precisely this limbo status. You wait for going home. And this was particularly visible in the case of children. Children didn't start learning, or few of them wanted to learn the Romanian language, which is very different from the Ukrainian language. So they were, some of them were enrolled in Romanian classes, others followed online the Ukrainian school system. At the same time, being home with mothers who tried to have a job and to have some work. So this limbo status where you wait constantly to go home or for the situation to change, kept families on their tiptoes, not knowing if they should invest the time, energy in learning a language which was not very familiar to them. That's about the mind status. Secondly, I think the Romanian state and also NGOs tried very hard in providing language classes and courses. This was implemented unevenly and depended very much from region to region. So I don't think in entire Romania all resources were available to provide language courses at times that would allow young mothers or mothers to go also to the course and also to follow a job. So this also created some frictions. Certainly, the fact that we are speaking about women and children hoping to be reunited with men who are on the front, not knowing which type of email or message you will get every moment. It creates a general state of anxiety that is a difficult burden to wear, and lets you very small mental space to focus on long-term plans or medium-term plans, and it is very difficult. And here I want to bring in also a third generation, along with women, young women and children came also elder people and seniors and grandparents who also had an experience, a different experience of war, who were, joining families. So we have single mothers suddenly that have to take care of their parents, elder parents of children, in managing so many aspects of daily life in a foreign country with, rely on subsidies that will come or not come, with a friendly initially. So I must say 18 months, Romanian population was quite welcoming and friendly, but it was very clear that the atmosphere in the public space was changing. So it is very difficult to juggle as a human being all these factors and say, okay, I'm very willing to be a new Romanian citizen, very well accommodated and integrated. This is what comes now to my mind. Maybe, Dania, from different case studies, if this applies also to other situations.
Well, it's been a long time since I talked about what happened in Bosnia, because of the war, and even in Kosovo. Let's say with Bosnia, you're talking about a long war compared to the other wars. Kosovo was a 78-day bombing campaign of Serbia. And consequently, what happened with the Kosovars is that they all left, moving into, they were accepted, a lot of people were accepted by the Albanian national government, and a number of people went into Montenegro and even over to Macedonia. They were accepted, and consequently it was a 78-day bombing campaign, and virtually 90% of everybody came back. That was completely exceptional. With regard to Bosnia, you're talking about the longest siege of Sarajevo, a modern city in contemporary history. And people made a decision, am I going to stay or am I going to go? It is a matter of pride of those who stayed and waited out the siege. And there is a big difference culturally between people who stayed and people who left. Also, there was a major refugee camp in Zagreb in Croatia, and many, many people from Bosnia went to that refugee camp before moving to a third country. Lots of people went to Turkey, many went to Germany, and then people also came into the United States. There's over 300,000 Bosniaks that live in the United States. In New York City, where I live, there's 40,000 Bosniaks that live in Queens. In St. Louis, it's the largest population of Bosniaks outside of Bosnia. There's 80,000 in St. Louis. In Australia, accepted. Because of that long war, less people came back. Less people actually participate in voting now. It's very down. They have the right to vote, but that number has dropped precipitously over the years. And there's less connection with home, that's why. And because you're talking about 3 different ethnic groups, it's not a cohesive population. For example, in the diaspora here in the United States, the Kosovars are highly cohesive and work really, really well, and they're entrepreneurs with incredible energy. You do have business owners among the Bosniaks in the United States for sure, but it's more diverse and it's more dispersed. There are centers, as I just mentioned. There's also a community in Utica. There's a community in down in Florida as well, near Gainesville. They're all around the country, but I would say that the Kosovars have really acclimated much faster and much more quickly, and I think it's due to their cohesiveness. One of the major issues that faced Bosnia, and I was there when that was happening, is that people had properties and they wanted perhaps to come back and reclaim it because somebody else was living in it, or they wanted to sell it and get rid of it. And that became a huge issue and challenge to the international community because there was a lot of fear, is another conflict going to break out if people go and visit their properties? And I actually was on a bus with voters from Srebrenica, and so people need to understand that Srebrenica is where 8,000, over 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered and women were raped by the Serbs during that genocide. People wanted to go visit their homes and they were said, no, you can't go visit. And people started screaming on the bus and saying, I want to get off, I don't want to go, turn this bus around. So I was witness to a lot of issues around property and about people returning to reclaim their property. And I would say ultimately it was a mixed bag because people just get so disconnected from their home and they can't necessarily make the trip back. So they might have a relative actually do that work for them. So
that's a good moment to make another interesting comparison, contrast here to see what kind of lines of difference and similarity we can find. I mean, one of the things that we were seeing in the Romanian case of Ukrainians in Romania is that because, again, in the context of a very long war, and in the context of a war that so far remains really more or less limited to the Donbass region, a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainian women have been and do a sort of a pendulum, what's it? A pendulum. So in other words, it's possible for them, having displaced as refugees into Romania, to go back home, to visit their husbands, to check on their property, to recharge their cells and to be able to, to touch with their neighbors. And that seems to me to be a pretty significant dimension we don't often see in situations of displacement.
You're extremely right, and I was about to mention this as well. So we often say that there's not such a large population of Ukrainians in Romania, which is misleading. I mean, the numbers are right. We don't have 1 million Ukrainians, but you have even more people crossing and living in between Romania and Ukraine, and also people living in many other countries passing through Romania. And this creates another level of challenge, and many of the public services which do not work in Ukraine anymore, like health, where all kinds of public services are accessed. So people are coming just to access them and then go back to Ukraine. And another very interesting particularity of the Romanian case is that most of the people are actually coming from the neighborhood counties from Ukraine, right? So they're not evenly distributed across the country. For those of you who maybe don't know this in detail, there is also a huge Romanian community living in Ukraine, ethnic Romanians, right? That's also a very sensitive topic, and that was politically instrumentalized a lot in the last years. And I think this was one of the networks which made it possible, this pendulum movement. And just a quick mention here related to your question about the EU money. This pendulum movement, it's also possible because we reopened all the possible communication infrastructure with Ukraine. Most of them were closed when the war started. We realized that we miss almost any connection with Ukraine. So I remember in the first days, people could not exchange the Ukrainian currency in Romania because banks were not accepted, because it was not common to do that. And now what we see, highways being built, train connections reintroduced, right? Like after, I don't know, 50 or 60 years, Bucharest to Kiev train was reintroduced, it was possible, right? So that's having the infrastructure and building this. So that's part of the story, and this is why a movement like this is possible, right? That's not necessarily possible in other contexts.
I would, sorry, I'm coming back to the TPS and to some technical things, because the TPS, which was a crazy innovation in the Colombian context, it's rather interesting to see in our cases how there's been contagion happening from one of our cases, which is at one end of the world, with the European Union that goes for the same system in the first days of the invasion. All of a sudden, the Colombian experiment with temporary protected status gets picked up across the other side of the world. And in the beginning, it's rather revolutionary. It provides immense freedoms that people who live in the US can't imagine seeing protections for people who are here in having different statuses. They can access all sorts of services. They can access work rights immediately. So at the same time, what the TPS does, it freezes one in the moment of them coming into the country. And Gabi was speaking about the limbo. Tony was speaking about the pendulum. It's a never-ending bloody limbo and pendulum that the TPS condemns you to. That happened in Colombia, and while it was revolutionary, it has turned into a situation where all of a sudden the disadvantages of the system became obvious when we organized our workshop 3 years ago, and the vulnerabilities that the status opened people up to suffering in a society. Similarly, we see these things happening in Romania and wider in the European Union, where one can access services. At the same time, they are in a precarious situation because they never know, they never can count on one side that these services will be available on the long term. And secondly, there's no path to citizenship. Like, let's not pretend. That's one of the horrible things about the European immigration system, that it had invented most of the marginalizing methods and institutions that are being copied in the United States now, and that have been practiced for decades in the European Union, especially in Western European countries. So consequently, we are facing a situation where the landscape is changing, but the institutional setup is frozen. Also, Romania started experiencing large-scale migration as a consequence of the opening of the labor market towards certain partner countries. And that has resulted in very different political stresses. And all of a sudden, you have migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and Ukrainian citizens who have TPS. Everybody has a different status. Civil society is trying to provide services, but everybody's experiencing different vulnerabilities. Sorry, just threw that in.
That was amazing. Thank you. That is absolutely like crystal clear. And I think I know Anatoly's mind, so I know what he's going to say now. So I'm going to ask him just to prove that I know it too. That the other form of vulnerability now that enters into it is the way that Ukrainian migration has been weaponized in national Romanian politics.
Yep. Just two short anecdotes before that. So it was designed, and you're right with the TPS, it was designed in such a laissez-faire way that initially there were no addresses on the permits. And then they realized that because we have a geographically scattered type of access to public services, then they realized that it matters if you live in a county or another, because this is the system that you get reimbursed the cost for it. And there are so many examples like this, which exactly proves the points you're trying to make. So for those of you who do not follow that part of the world, we've got several rounds of elections to 2024 and 2025, president and parliamentary. The presidential one was cancelled. We discovered that not at all known guy, very interesting, with a lot of support in diaspora and a lot of influence from TikTok and social media campaigns, was about, actually, I think he won. We don't know, but if you're looking at polls and the data available, he was anyway going to the final in one way or another. So the elections were cancelled. There were a number of, it's not clear what happened and what was the problem. Ukrainians and subjects related to Ukrainians were among the most important narratives used in the elections. We did several studies in this regard, and you can see that, for instance, one of the most common narratives used in these social media campaigns is that kids from Ukraine get 10 times more money as a form of support compared to kids, Romanian kids, and several other things like that. And in this polarized context, we see more and more discrimination happening. With Gabi, we had a number of trainings in different parts of Romania. Communities from there mentioned being, I think, even attacked on the street, right? Or at least in traffic, in contexts like that. And yeah, it's increasingly polarized. And
so just to make this explicit, because I want to hear about this in particular, what's being suggested here is that I mean, this is very simple, oversimplifying, so bear with me. It's more complicated, but if you take 4 years of displacement, you have an initial highly constructive and highly positive response that, for better and for worse, was tied to the European Union's immigration policies that created Ukrainians as a demographic that, on the one hand, had remarkably unfettered access to a whole bunch of services, but on the other hand, also, as you put it, put them in a sort of a legal, but also a social and cultural limbo that then gradually was also a push factor for rising levels of xenophobia, rising levels of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And with that comes rising risks of identity-based violence. So we can plot out over the course of these 4 years the way these factors work. And of course, this we're talking about with the Romanian Unity Party, who were pretty successful, frankly, in weaponizing immigration, among other things, such as the idea of creating a greater Romania that includes like annexing Moldova, and parts of Ukraine. So I don't know. Here's a sort of like what if question. Was this avoidable? Was it avoidable? Could that initial constructive and legally, culturally, politically, economically promising the Colson's moment, welcoming moment, could that have been made sustainable? And by whom and how? So we'll start with Gabby.
I have here an idea because Tony mentioned the narrative part. So in contrast to how well prepared the society responded to the humanitarian crisis, on the narrative front, Romania did poorly and wasn't that prepared. And just as a background information, migration was never a topic of discussion before 2020. So we spoke about migration, but rather of technical aspects of migration, or about the social and political and economic impact of the huge diaspora, because Romania, exported a lot of labor migration. So suddenly we have this humanitarian crisis. We haven't thought really as a society about narratives of migration. We have no study mapping circulating narratives about migration. Everything seems fine for, let's say, 1 year or so, when compassion fatigue and solidarity fatigue and economic pressure starts to rise. So this is maybe one of the critique points that we could bring up for state authorities, not investing more in preparing a clear, comprehensible, inclusive narrative, well documented, regarding migrants. And Tony has mentioned the supports and the subsidies were given. This, I was asked once to give an interview, and it was difficult for myself to find the actual numbers and the links and the documents to prove that the subsidies and the support was that and for these services provided. Imagine someone who is just spending his time on TikTok or this type of information channels. So because we are at the forum about prevention, and I want to add one more thing. It's a pity because Romania was a welcoming country, and when we are conducting our research on the narratives on migration, and when we started our research, we found out that what we call movable middle. The movable middle are persons who do not have a rigid opinion about whether migration is good or positive or just bad or done. This was quite high in Romania, over 63%. This is immense. So not even jeopardized by the Western imported narratives and security frames, about migration. So you have right there a generous movable middle, but you are then not able or unable for whatever reasons to come up with a clear communication strategy about Romania as a recipient country, not just a transit country. And this was one of the shortfalls which was capitalized in times of social political crisis like the annulled elections. Another discussion, how that contributed to democratic backsliding in Romania. I don't want to get into there, but it was suddenly capitalized by so-called anti-system parties, which are not anti-system parties, but populist parties. And migrants became once again the preferred scapegoat in this context.
And what happened?
With the elections, we don't know.
No,
Officially.
there are little green men. Yeah. What happened? I mean, I'm sure it's too complicated to answer in a pat way, but what happened to that? All of that coordination between national and civil society actors that made the initial reception so counterintuitively safe.
So responses were there, but still fragmented in the entire landscape. Every civil society or significant civil society actor communicated in his own way about migration. State did as well, and if I have still 1 minute, I want to give another example on communication gone wrong and how it can jeopardize, a very commendable initiative. So in July 2025, the municipality, the city hall of Bucharest decides we have many labor migrants and migration has becoming more visible in the Romanian public sphere. Let's put up a strategy on how to integrate migrants beyond, the refugee emergency response. They write a text in collaboration with international organizations, with IOM, UNHCR, with civil society experts, and put it online for public debate. Immediately, in a coordinated attack, this long text that is very, very boring and is not very sensitive. It just speaks about funding and how to help NGOs to support migrants, so nothing there gets attacked. From the comments online, in this online forum, it was pretty much clear that no one went beyond the title of these strategies, integrating migrants. But it, opened the floor for a lot of conspiracy theory, ground replacement theory, Islamization of Europe, of Romania, what's Brussels imposing on us, and so on. Some critique points were valid coming from experts like Anatolia here, who said maybe outdated data was used or the time of consultations. But what's frightening is the fact that it was clear a coordinated attack on jeopardizing the strategy. Now, what does the state? You would think the state is smart enough to counter all these reactions with a clear response, with numbers, statistics, and so on. Unfortunately, for some reasons that I don't know, they decide to withdraw the strategy, acknowledging the negative feedback, at the same time allowing a far-right march to take place in Bucharest, which of course the far-right movement capitalized on a huge victory. We are defending Bucharest, Romania from this replacement theory and so on. A big outcry in social media, NGOs say you can't do that. City Hall again takes the right back, for this march to take place. So these hesitant movements, because you do not have a clear, comprehensible, transparent strategy on how do you want to communicate about migration, how do we understand migration, and how we make it, palatable for the wider public, is again, an example how you can bury commendable initiatives. Because I know from Anatolia that another cosmopolitan city like Timișoara, with many migrants, try to do the same and follow Bucharest's example, but now they shied away. So just to give you a very concrete and practical example how this could have been prevented.
And if I can add to that, we also developed last year a national strategy for migration. And it doesn't have even one mention of the Ukrainian community for that reason. Right? Very strange. It's a very politicized subject, and there is a lot of, pushback or somehow to call it. So that's also very, very interesting that a failure like this has not been reflected and introduced at all in this national strategy for migration.
If I may.
I'll refer to you.
So I was going to speak to your question, Max, about coordination. From our engagement with civil society and refugee organizations, local government, regional government, national government, and everything that you can imagine in the workshop we organized in Oradea this year, the coordination is continuing when it comes to service provision. It's rather fascinating to see how this cooperation between all governmental levels, civil society, is very well ingrained, functioning immensely well in terms of service provision. At the same time, the coordination fails completely in terms of thinking about protection of migrants as possible victims of identity-based violence in a Romanian context. And this was a bit baffling to all people in the room at this workshop. The fact that technical cooperation is very easy when it comes to implementing policies related to, ensuring basic goods and services reach beneficiaries. Nonetheless, there's a genuine difficulty in coming together in terms of protection issues. And this is very interesting. My colleagues in Romania have been investigating quite a bit how narratives can be changed, how we can engage with this. Still, it's a huge challenge, and it's a challenge that's seen in many contexts. The lack of focus on atrocity prevention issues and focusing on technical service delivery issues at the same time. I cannot understate how important the imported narratives related to migrants and refugees are in this context. The current environment in the US, the current environment in several Western European countries, the current environment in Hungary have resulted in lots of extremely xenophobic, extremely anti-migrant discourses taking root within domestic politics in Romania and making the international reality is actually making, to a certain extent, any local action come at a far higher cost than it could have come 4 years ago.
Before we go turn to Q&A.
Yes, I just want to point out something. I really kind of hit my forehead. The Balkan Wars and this war in Ukraine, all three wars are remarkable and notable for sexual violence against all populations in those countries. So I'm obviously victim-centered, and I'm thinking about what happened to these people in terms of psychosocial supports. And I did look up, I had enough time to look up Romanian laws on abortion, and it is legal up to 14 weeks gestation. However, a lot of doctors choose to exercise a conscience clause and will not perform abortions. So that was an issue also for Ukrainian women going into Poland. And all I want to say about that is that we are talking about, in terms of Ukraine and in Bosnia, long-term detention. Many were put in rape camps and they were detained, including men. And we're talking about seriously traumatized people that absolutely need psychological services as well as medical services. And I want to add to this that I have friends from Bosnia to this day that may live in the United States, and they call a psychiatrist in Sarajevo to talk to, still getting services, psychosocial needs. And also with regard to Ukraine, the most outrageous crime. And I said to my colleague here, Natalia, that forced transfer of over 20,000 children from Ukraine is one of the most outrageous crimes I have ever become known to me. And I have not noticed similar actions historically, at least in modern history, that this took place. But I would also add that we're talking about people with really long-term issues, both psychologically and physically, and many of the women have lost their husbands, therefore they are also compounded by poverty. And many of them have chronic health conditions if they were repeatedly raped, and therefore they don't necessarily have money to purchase prescriptions to this day. So I want to say, talk about prevention. We must prevent this. We must begin to look at this with different position from we have as we looked at it in the past.
Just a small comment, Romania is actually a very generous welfare state, far more generous than the state of New York and the United States government when it comes to these things. So one reality was for women coming into Romania, SGB services were accessible, and that was another interesting thing in the first reaction, that there was high access, but the linguistic issues, and also Romania is a highly bureaucratized welfare state, which means you don't easily navigate as a foreigner where you can access the services you have the right to access. That was in the very initial phase a big hurdle in accessing services. But here I want to talk about civil society, which we've seen amazing things happen in Romanian civil society, and Tony's part of some people, a group of people who have worked immensely to create tools for people coming into the country to find easy solutions, electronic solutions, data on how to access services, to the extent that accessing of services became rather quickly very smooth. And so that was also one of the big successes of the initial days. And the services are solid in most of the country in a way that they are not solid in other places in our world, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes, let's go to our audience. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Małgorzata Melchoniewska. I'm from Poland. Trained in international and European law. So thank you very much. I mean, I have a few comments and a question. Okay. Thank you very much for bringing up how complicated the migration and asylum law we have in the European Union, because not so many people understand the differences, including people in the European Union. The officials, they also don't recognize and distinguish things. So this is very complicated. And I think that the general discussion of the Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers should be, put in the broader context. We have, in European Union, we struggle with the migration crisis for the last few years. And that influences the migration and asylum policy of the European Union, which is new right now, and it's being introduced. It will be in power in a few weeks, starting from now. So when speaking about being welcome and then this changing the narration, I think it's also because of the general discussion on the European Union migration and the obligatory, relocation of migrants. And speaking about Romania and Poland, I see a lot of similarities and differences. First big difference is, of course, numbers. Just to give you the picture, only in the first week of the Ukraine. Sorry. Poland accommodated more than 500,000 of Ukrainians.
Let's just swap out the mic.
Our institutions were not prepared for accommodate such a number. So what you said about Romanian people, individuals and NGOs, we saw the same in Poland.
Honestly, only individuals and NGOs were in the borders. The officials were in Warsaw, not knowing what to do with the whole issues and problems. So that's something similar. I'm actually very surprised to know that the Romanian government, finally found the general solutions, and that's what you said, because in Poland, there was no idea how to coordinate, how to deal with that, and we still don't know what to do with a lot of issues. But the questions. Firstly, I want to ask about trauma. If you find any programs or procedures, how to help people to overcome trauma. And the second thing about the communication, second question, because you said that it's a lot of misunderstandings and the narrative has changed. Do you have any idea how to monitor narrative in social media, especially if this is influenced by Russians and Russian community? Thank you.
So regarding trauma, I know that, and we also had in the Safer Havens workshop in Oradea, many NGOs who are providing specialized service precisely in this field. What we try to do, and maybe we'll have time to speak, we have a training for law enforcement where we asked our younger colleagues that will be deployed as border police agents if they were well versed or if they received specialized training in how to interview someone who could be potentially traumatized, or they didn't. So it's a big desideratum to introduce in in law enforcement training and offer border police agents in training this aspect. Regarding the monitoring of this, I think Tony will answer and then I'll follow up.
Just a few words about trauma as well. So there was a huge, most of the international organizations, and especially after the US stopped financing and being active withdraw from Romania. Many of them were involved in mental health, well-being programs, mentoring, all kinds of projects, including UNHCR, the United Nations Agency for Refugees. And these were some of the first things we saw disappearing from the community when this happened. So in the town where I live, there is a hub called the Ukrainian House that was kept alive through support from various donors, countries, the UN system, and so on. And this is what they provided, a lot of mental health programs, but also, just a place to meet and to exchange ideas, communicate, and so on. And this is, we see so many examples like that all over Romania. These basic things were the first to disappear, because this is the state does not support this kind of thing. That's not necessarily part of the package, the welfare package we provide. And when it happened 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, we saw more and more international organizations, international civil society, NGOs going away from the subject, and most of these programs disappeared. And it's a bit strange also that having a heavily, not bureaucratized, but there are a lot of regulations in the labor market. You cannot employ Ukrainian, let's say, Ukrainians with background in this field, so you cannot employ them in the education system or where you need them, because you have this labor market. So you have this very strange position where you cannot do much because the civil society cannot provide it, the state cannot provide it, so communities are left to fight for themselves. Related to the second question, the one that monitors, we do that, and this is one of my roles to support government and other institutions in doing research on topics like this. We do, for instance, the so-called social listening, right? So you can monitor the groups, you can see which are the words used in which context, and I can tell you that that's about the ground. There is a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of exploitation happening there, and very interesting. We do that also in comparative. In a comparative manner. I also have a lot of research and work done with Romanians living abroad. And it's so interesting that so often the same narratives, the same fake news, the same stories are reflected on both sides of the spectrum of the mobility, right? So things you hear about Romanians in Italy will appear here as well with Ukrainians in Romania. Exactly the same type of arguments, exactly the same type of logics and examples, like even back. You can see them, the same story that a group of people ate rabbits in a park in the middle of Italy. You will see exactly the same story being mentioned with Ukrainians in Romania. It's really interesting.
Sorry, yes, yeah, please, you go first. You go.
No, you go.
No, you go about the narratives. I knew you were going to say. Then I go. Yeah.
No, we indeed we worked on a study in looking what type of articles appear, and it was clear that the annual elections were a turning point. So it's clear that there is also foreign interference in this, but nonetheless, and I come back to if you invest more in a resilient community and in the resilience of your society, maybe this will not be so successful. So we have in Europe the European Digital Act. We hope for a regulation that will monitor all the big tech companies in this field. Still, I think that the key remains training, education in detecting all these patterns. I am a huge fan of training and in-person discussion. And I don't want to add to the gloominess of the previous day. It might be that we have lost the battle in the online environment. So we cannot rely just on banning posts and they will appear on different channels of communication. And we have we are constantly in this debate. What is free speech? What are the limits of free speech? Let's ban everything. They will just go underground out of sight.
I would add to the European context a bit of thinking in relation to yesterday's discussion. I think Romania is one of the interesting case studies where we were speaking a lot about these strange spaces where democratic states exercise very undemocratic policies towards populations that are vulnerable, that seem to be outside the usual understanding of rule of law. Europe has been, when it comes to migrants, one of the leading spaces of marginalizing migrants and refugees, and it's an actual authoritarian reserve domain. The way European states behave towards migrants and refugees do not take into account basic human rights that are guaranteed to every human being around the world. So it's very important to also be aware that European states from the East are often importing structural structures that are replicating in their states this marginalization in a way that opens new fault lines and new undemocratic spaces within states that are actually trying to protect their citizens because they have recent memories of victimization. So it's immensely important also to not just focus on these pre-drawn fault lines of social media, but also to engaging to traditional tactics of legal contestation within national courts of European migration policy that, oh my God, has lots of problems. Has anybody spoken to the European migration agencies and the internal policies they use and that they don't publish because they don't want any scrutiny? So let us engage into some traditional activism related to human rights and to rights that citizens enjoy in Romania and other places. It's not all online. It's very often in the institutions. Yeah.
I want to make a point here. There was actually a decision by the European Court of Human Rights with respect to Croatia, because during the Syrian refugee surge into the Balkans, they ended up in an open field in the Bosnian border with Croatia. And unfortunately, Bosnia didn't get any money. Belgrade, by the way, did an excellent job of accommodating Syrian refugees in this surge. But as you point out, they used the Schengen zone to keep migrants out. And what happened at the border between Bosnia and Croatia is the Croat police beat the hell out of these people and really abused them. And there was a lawsuit brought at the European Court against Croatia, who was an EU member, and no one in the Schengen zone, no one in Western Europe said anything about it. They just looked past the decision. What's also happening right now, which is what the United States started doing, is that Maloney made a deal with the Prime Minister of Albania to hold migrants who are applying to get in a holding facility, and a young man died during his period of being held. So that is becoming a model. And as a matter of fact, Mexico is holding people that have applied for asylum into the United States. That's a deal that Trump made with the Mexicans. as an example. It's not a good thing.
Great, okay, we're going to, we've got 6 minutes, so I'm gonna collect a few questions, okay? Nice and concise.
Yeah, I come from a country which has a huge experience with migrants. Uganda, a poor country, but hosts about 1.5 million refugees for many years. And what I wanted to say is it has a model. For instance, when migrants come in, they give them plots of land even to do agriculture and other things. And what's most interesting is that it has not resulted in any significant backlash from the local communities. I think because there is a model again, 70-30, where even the local communities are considered in any kind of assistance program. And Romania being a wealthy country, why is it so hard for it to have such programs which are supported by the people?
Who's next? I think, Jimmy, you had your hand up. Okay. Who else? Who's up there? Maria.
Thank you, all of you, for talking about these important things. Tibby, to your point about,
Hold the mic a little closer.
hello, okay. Tibby, to your point about, these democratic nations having largely undemocratic policies and attitudes towards migrants and refugees, I guess this is sort of a chicken and an egg question. Like, do you think that these institutions have been built on existing cultures of nationalism and cultural competitiveness, or rather these institutions have bred that nationalism? And so how do we sort of go in and disrupt that culture, so to speak?
Okay, take one more question.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this topic. I just wanted to see if you noticed any double standard in terms of how in Romania they treat Syrian and perhaps Southeast Asian refugees in comparison to the Ukrainian. Obviously, Tanya mentioned how I think Syrians form the highest number of refugee applicants to Romania, if I'm not mistaken, applications in terms of applications. But in terms of having been accepting, they're among the least, I suppose. So is there like a double standard dual system in terms of how migrants are treated according to their maybe racial backgrounds or some maybe white supremacy here at play?
I had a comment.
For each one.
So I'll answer to the last one maybe. I don't know if there is a white supremacy discussion, but we're going there in a way or another. So we're quite late in this wave of populism and right-wing political parties being represented in the parliament and having large support in the community. That happened for a while already in Poland, right? You know the case. It happened in Hungary. We now discuss about it also because there are elections and it's up on the agenda. But it's happening more and more, and it's happening also systematically. We have, I think, a legal system where we distinguish and have double standards in so many ways. Actually, when it comes to refugees and migrants in Romania, we have the least favorable system to support political and civic rights. So there is this, it's a research called MIPEX, Migration and Immigration Policy Index. And this is where we constantly score one of the lowest in terms of political and civic rights for communities. People cannot join associations, they cannot vote, right? They cannot have political leaders to represent their voice and their interest. And I think that will that will have consequences in various ways.
Maybe I can add to this. I don't know if, because I'm not so familiar with discrimination cases on institutional level, but it's true that incidents that surfaced in the public sphere involved especially citizens from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, so persons with a darker skin. And it was clearly that there was also racist motivation around it and component around it. And it was also very clear that these incidents appeared after the spokesperson and vice president of this populist party called out, foreign workers and advised the population not to take deliveries from, foreign deliverers, who are very visible in Romania and in the public sphere. So I think this is something that is very concerning and worrisome. But I think with many, with also economic pressure rising up and social fragmentation increasing over the time, this distinction will soon fade away. And I fear that both refugees and, dark skin or not, will face the threat of being transformed into scapegoats.
So this distinction will fade away, just the exact opposite of the way that we want it to.
Yeah.
And maybe to add to this one, we do have a substantial Roma community living in Romania, right?
Yes.
And there are tens of thousands of Ukrainian Roma who also cross the border.
Yeah, and we talk about Ukrainian refugees, but there were a large number of non-Ukrainians from Ukraine coming to Romania. But maybe we can talk about it. But what I want to say here is that the first incidents, the first serious incidents, the first xenophobic accidents happen very often in these poor communities, in these Roma communities, or in places where foreign citizens and some of the most vulnerable communities in Romania work together. It's very, very interesting, and I think it adds an additional layer of pressure and friction, which none necessarily exists in other countries.
And just an add-on, and I'm glad you brought it up. There were several incidents reported regarding the Ukrainian refugees with Roma background that were treated differently, not just in Romania, but in several other countries. And
There's
weren't
often the
receiving
accusation
the
that you
same,
can't be a refugee if you're a Roma.
yeah. And the cynical hierarchization of human beings.
Yeah, and to your question, and combining a bit with the last question, and sorry, making again reference to the European frame. The European frame legalizes difference of treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. The fact that there's TPS for Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers, and there's no such process for anybody from anywhere else, is also inspired by, call them however you want, racist, neo-colonial dynamics that have been channeled into contemporary decision-making at the highest levels. Similarly, it's omnipresent, this fragmentation of status within different European states, and the actual hurdles for refugee-led organizations to sit at the table and to be part of the conversation. We were rather impressed about how present refugee-led organizations were in Colombia and in Kenya in discussing policy options. But in a European context, that is never the case. And some of it is motivated by legislation that doesn't allow association of people who are seeking, who are in the process of being granted or are refugees or asylum seekers. So it's a very, very adverse environment that we are talking about. How to disrupt it? I do believe there are so many opportunities to disrupt it. Institutional, legal, political opportunities, and NGOs. One of the things that I am sure Tony and Gabi are rather modest and don't speak about and didn't mention a lot is Some of the work is about actually assisting NGOs who provide service to refugee communities to also apply an atrocity prevention lens to their work. And that's a bit revolutionary in this context, but also not sensitive anymore because unfortunately the awareness of high risks of identity-based violence is very real everywhere. It's not a bear anymore. It's actually present in societies that thought of themselves as places where things couldn't happen. And Romania never thought of itself that way, given our recent histories that are very unfortunate. So I think, yeah, energy is needed, information and cooperation, coordination. But the nice bit is that civil society actors in Romania have a very good history of working together when things get tricky. So we also derived quite a bit of optimism from this as an organization that informs current work, and it's rather inspiring, in spite of the pretty rough context.
On that, and we are at time on that very inspiring note, please join me in thanking our panelists.